Hello and welcome to Research in Profile, the flagship platform in which we broadcast the latest research insights and achievements from the School of Political Science and International Studies. My name is Andrew Phillips, an Associate Professor and Bon Vivant within the school, and today I am proud to be joining Professor Tim Dunne and Professor Reus-Smit to talk about their latest titanic research achievement, the globalization of international society. Welcome to Research in Profile.
Thank you, Andrew.
So I just wanted to start with this concept of international society. Obviously, it's the central concept of the English school and it features as a centrepiece of this volume. I wonder if you could give us a sense to the uninitiated of what is really meant by this concept of international society.
Yes, I think that's a critical starting point to understanding this book, and it obviously runs right to the heart of the English school, which many of the thinkers involved in the expansion of international society associated themselves with. And essentially, that the heart of the claim is that the global order, or at least the international, is a social realm, and that social realm is evident when a group of states, conscious of certain common interests and common values, come together to participate in the working of common institutions. So inside that quote, you have really the assemblage of international society. You have sovereign state members, you have rules and institutions, and you have a common purpose, a shared purpose of sort of managing order. Now, what the anarchical society, where that quotation in a sense came from originally in 1977, Bull's own work, what the anarchical society really didn't do is give us much of a history of what that international society was. And when Bull does talk about the history, it's really not very good. There's very little about the non-European experience in relation to shared institutions and shared understandings. And more importantly, he uses this sort of shadow idea that there's an international system of, if you like, of interests and power prior to the emergence, the kind of immaculate emergence of this social order around the time of the 17th century. It's really not a very good historical account. That didn't matter much to the anarchical society because its contribution was mainly analytical and not historical. But for the expansion, it really does matter how we understand international society, how they understood it, and critically also how the agents themselves who are doing the participating, how do the agents understand that process of world making and making the global order?
Yes, I wanted to ask you about that because clearly the title is a riff off the classic work, The Expansion of International Society. And I'd just be really curious if you could give us a sense of why now to revisit this book? What is the urgency that was driving this project for both of you?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the immediate catalyst was that it was we were coming up to the 30th anniversary of the publication of the original Bull and Watson book on the expansion of international society, but also a sense that international society itself now is experiencing a number of far-reaching transformations, from shifts in the global distribution of power to transformations in the world economy to new forms of resistance that are rising up to challenge core institutions of that international society, and really understanding how that society came to be, how we got a global society of sovereign states in the first place, which really is actually very recent, about 50 years ago in its last act in the final stages of decolonisation. Really understanding how that came about is pretty important to understanding how the dynamics of contemporary world politics are playing out. However, the sense that of the existing literature about that process of the globalisation of international society from its kind of original European core, that story is quite problematic in many regards. And so what we wanted to do was revisit the question of how you get a global society of sovereign states, but draw on the wealth of new intellectual resources that exist today in history and sociology and law to really look at that again.
Yeah, I wanted to actually press you a bit on that in terms of getting a clearer sense of what is it that Bull and Watson got wrong in their expansion story? And in particular, one of the things that I found really interesting with the project, and I should declare an interest, I have a chapter in the book, so I'm heavily invested in it, is this question of expansion versus globalisation. And what are the theoretical stakes that are at play in that distinction, and why is it that you thought globalisation was a superior alternative to the expansion narrative?
Well, maybe we can tag a little bit on this answer, but I just wanted to say, first of all, that rather than thinking about what they got wrong, it's useful to remind ourselves actually what they got right. And if you think about what was being written about in 1984 in IR, for a group of thinkers essentially organised in very elite British universities, for a group and practitioners to get together and try and understand essentially large-scale historical change, this was really something that, other than a few fringe Marxists, was really not happening in the discipline of IR. Think about 1979, we've got Kenneth Waltz's theory of international politics, 1983, Gilpin's War on Change. Then there's neorealism and its critics. They're all happening in the early 1980s. And yet you've got this group of self-identified international relations theorists and practitioners who are taking an entirely different canvas for the international. And in a sense, I think the first thing we should do really is to acknowledge that that's probably a more longer lasting contribution than many of the others that are sort of dying a little bit of a long, slow death of isms. And yet this really interesting historical and sociological account of the global order is very much, I think, being revived through world history, through global IR, through large-scale constructivist analysis and so on. So I think starting with what they got right is important too.
So I think what Tim said particularly important is that they're looking, is that the existing international system at this time was very much taken for granted, that this was extant. You could look at the dynamics going on within that system, but you didn't need to understand how that system came about. And what Bull and Watson do is open up that question. And they also open up a whole series of questions that are associated to do with that, around questions of contestation, cultural diversity, issues that are now very important when we're thinking about world politics, and they at least posed the questions, even if they got those questions wrong. However, having said that, I think our use of the term globalisation, in a sense, captures much of what we're trying to say that's different from what Bull and Watson said. So, in the concept of the expansion of international society, you've got, in the idea of expansion, you've got the sense of something that emerges in Europe and then expands to encompass the globe, essentially remaining the same, right? It just gets bigger, okay? Whereas the concept of globalisation captures two things: the becoming global of the society of states, but also the processes of global interaction that really shaped that system. So that society of states that emerges in Europe, by the time it becomes global, it's something very different than it was, and it's something very different as a consequence of the global social processes that were transforming it. In the Bull and Watson account, the story is very much a story about the internal dynamics of that society of states, whereas we're trying to embed that institutional complex in a much wider set of global processes.
There's a thread I'd like to pick up on that you mentioned very briefly, but it is one of the main motifs of the book, this idea of the relationship between cultural diversity and international order. And obviously in Bull and Watson, there's a very strong apprehension about the idea of the corrosion of cultural consensus as being a real catalyst for the destruction of international order. And interestingly, the contributions in this volume seem to take a different and somewhat more optimistic take on the question of cultural diversity in international order. I was wondering if you might be able to speak to that question.
Yeah, in the classical English school account, you've got someone like Martin White, and it's very much shared with other writers at the time, saying really international society was built upon the edifice of cultural homogeneity. And of course, the risk with that sort of understanding of the global order is that as you globalise, the resilience of that social order becomes questioned, and there are various different resistances and responses that actually start to undermine and hollow out the very basis of that international order. And that was really the kind of starting point. But overlaying that really is, I think, also a very kind of conservative ethos that essentially, only the Europeans had managed to discover this kind of this ordering, this semblance of order and justice, and it wasn't really, other peoples were not quite ready. And of course, this is very much the standard of civilization narrative that comes through a lot in the 19th century writings on diplomacy and law. And there are residues of that inside that Bull and Watson account. And of course, we wanted to show actually the circulation of international social norms and expectations, which is very much a global process, and it's very much a two-way process that doesn't really get a proper understanding inside the expansion, which really does does have a hint of an Orientalist account of the global order, which is not one that one would sustain in a post-colonial understanding of international relations.
Of course, they're very famously on that the English school scholars had great anxieties about the idea of this revolt against the West. And you've got a really terrific contribution from Professor Ian Hall from Griffith University. Ian, if you are watching this, by the way, I have now mentioned you, so please do retweet this. He's got a really terrific contribution which really unsettles that idea of the notion of international society's fragility in the face of challenges from non-Western actors. I was wondering if you might be able to speak a little bit to this theme of resilience, because obviously some of the classic narratives talk about the idea of contestation as being a fundamentally corrosive process for international order. But you propose a very different alternative in this volume, so I was wondering if you'd be able to enlighten us a little about that process.
So I think that one of the things that we're trying to do is you've sort of hit the nail on the head in the sense that contestation in the traditional narrative is seen as being destructive of international society, whereas what we wanted to do was to place contestation right at the heart of the generative processes by which international society grows and transforms and develops and is produced and reproduced. And in this respect, I think, and we don't really use this language, but in this respect, I think what comes through in this is the notion of international society as much more of a process, that's something that is constantly being transformed through practices, through contestation, and so it has a much more dynamic quality. And so we wanted to place contestation much more at the heart of our notion of the globalization of international society.
I mean, that's fascinating in terms of that theme of contestation, because obviously there is at least a very strong sense among many of an unprecedented degree of fluidity within the international system at the moment. We're over 15 years into the war on terror, so there's the threat of transnational jihadist terrorism. More recently, we've had, particularly with the post-global financial crisis, this perception of the idea of non-Western powers becoming much more prominent as actors within the international system. And obviously, within the last 12 months, we've had the nativist far-right tsunami sweeping through the Western world. So there are many that would look at the international system at the moment and see a fairly stark picture of entropy playing out. I was wondering, particularly given the spirit of anxiety within which Expansion of International Society was written, does this volume represent a contribution or an elaboration of that anxiety, or an antidote to it? To put it more simply, considering all of the contributions in the volume, are you more optimistic or pessimistic about the resilience of international society in the face of contemporary challenges?
Well, perhaps I'll have one go at that, is to say, well, which international society has got resilience, has got more or less resilience, and I think that's an argument we don't confront fully in the book, and maybe that's an argument that other people can build on. And by saying that, I'm suggesting that essentially there are very different configurations of what this international society is today. There are your liberal internationalists who want an international society where there's a really strong consensus around shared values and shared norms around human rights, democratization, and so on. But you also have a more limited conception of international society, which is very much predicated on a kind of particularistic sort of universalism, where there are a multiplicity of cultures and peoples, as it were, that are interacting on a much more limited basis than that strong kind of solidarist internationalism. So I would kind of come back within the contemporary debates to say, well, you know, if you're looking at the classical English school writings, they pretty much found themselves actually preferring, if you like, the more limited aspects of international society, the pluralist sort of model, which does allow for different cultures, it does allow for elements of contestation, while recognising, as it were, that there are significant common interests in the maintenance of order. And it seems to me that particular vision of international society, that particular understanding of international society is alive and well, and it's very much alive and well in many of outside of the Western world, in fact. They have a very strong argument. The Chinese, for example, have a very, very strong argument to say actually the rule breakers and the pathologies of international society are actually in those voices that claim to have owned and delivered that model to the world, rather than in those who are actually ostensibly being represented as those who are looking to contest and undermine that order. So I think we need to be careful about, well, which international society is it that's in trouble? And I think in that book we're trying to capture a multiplicity of historical experiences, a multiplicity of theoretical perspectives, which say that really probably there isn't a single answer to that question, although we might all agree that certain versions of international society are in trouble at the moment.
Yeah, there's a phrase that you briefly referenced there, particularistic universalism or pluralistic universalism. And that resonates very strongly with a theme that comes out towards the book's conclusion, where you fairly strongly align the book in many respects with the agenda that is emerging at the moment of global international relations, trying to recast the discipline of international relations in a self-consciously global rather than Eurocentric manner. I was wondering if you might be able to elaborate a little bit on that in terms of the global IR agenda and where you see the globalisation of international society really feeding into those larger debates.
Well, maybe if Chris doesn't mind, I might have the first go at that, since I led the drafting on that. He led the drafting on many of the other parts of the book. But what interested me in relation to sort of global IR is that global IR seems to me to be very convergent with many of the themes in the book. So the first thing I think global IR points out is that all of our concepts and ideas have a history. And if we don't have a good understanding of that history, we're going to be limited in our understanding of how those possibilities for change are going to be undertaken. And that really goes back to sort of Chris's first answer. We were looking to recover and also to critique, if you like, the history that was presented in the original expansion volume. So I think that's an element where we're convergent with a global IR, is opening up different historical understandings of how we got this way. That's the first point. I think the second point is, and which has also been touched upon, is a very different conception of agency than you get in many conventional accounts of international relations. We want a conception of agency where those voices, as it were, that had not been part of the conventional story about diplomats and soldiers and lawyers, if that's the conventional account that Aaron believes it is, and so to some extent Hedley Bull, we actually wanted an account which talks about indigenous communities in North America and their understanding of international society in the 16th, 17th and 18th century and their practices, and what does our engagement with their experiences, mediated through Nita Crawford's fantastic chapter, what does that really tell us about different ways in which we can have shared understandings about process, about justice, about institutions and how they operate and how they reform. So across a whole series of registers, really, we wanted to bring to the surface really different conceptions of agency without actually taking a kind of subject position that said the great powers are the ones that really matter in this, and the voiceless, we can kind of leave that to the NGOs. We didn't really want to come down on that conventional view, and neither did we want to attach some sort of heroic sort of subject position for the dispossessed to say that they can also rise up and defeat the conservative forces of the global order. So we very much, again, I think, left that open, but we wanted that multiplicity to come to the fore. And I also think another element of the global IR agenda, which is also in the book, is that we want that story to be a story that's told in several kinds of ways. We want it to be a story about the Ottomans. We want it to be a story about the Chinese. And there's a wonderful chapter by Yongjin Zhang about China. And if you knew nothing about the last 150 years, this is a story about Chinese hegemony and Chinese confidence and Chinese domination of a global trading system. It's a perfect chapter. But of course, if you do the IR genealogy, as it were, you have a very different understanding of China. And yet the recovery, Yongjin Zhang's recovery, suggests to us, I think, a future order and how a future order can be imagined in the way that it was experienced in the 14th, 15th and 16th century. And there's other really good examples. I think there's that Hendrik Sproit has a beautiful chapter, which is really an area that's not been written about, which is sort of South Asia and South Asia conceptions of international, Southeast Asia conceptions of international society. And therefore that, going back to that story that we really wanted to tell from very many different subject positions and actually different theoretical commitments as well. The thinkers I've mentioned don't really stack up inside a single camp, and we didn't want that either. We wanted people really to come together because they had essentially an interest in sociological conceptions in the international, but also a commitment to sort of cultural and theoretical and to some extent methodological pluralism, and I believe that's what we got.
So if I could just add one thing to that. So one of the ways in which IR scholars tend to theorise the international is to treat the international as a closed system. So you have an international system or an international society, and then you study the internal dynamics of that. And I think one of the things that runs through the entire book, an ethos running through the entire book, is actually to treat international society as an open system. And as soon as you treat it as an open system, then you, by definition, you're forced to engage the questions of the global, because it doesn't matter where you cut into that history over, let's say, the last 5 centuries, this thing that we could identify as an institutional assemblage that we call international society was deeply constituted by global social processes. And so I think the book, one of the messages of the book is, this may not be parsimonious, this may not be amenable to the study of kind of regularized causal relations between a fixed set of variables. That can be done in a closed system. But in an open system, you have a much more complex set of global processes. And I think that's, and one of the things that Global IR is trying to do is to push away from the closed system mentality to think of open global systems.
That actually offers a very convenient segue into my next question, which is, and it's an extraordinary book in terms of the insights that it offers to those of us that are deeply invested in international relations theory. But it also, just bouncing off your last point, would seem to have a fairly important practical resonance for policymakers trying to navigate what is really an increasingly interconnected but complex and in many ways fragmented world. So I was just wondering, and I know you love the policy relevance question, Chris, what is the value that you think can be taken from a global IR sensibility when we take this from the realm of academic debate to marshalling the insights out of this volume to help us make better sense of the contemporary international system, I guess from a more of a practical standpoint?
Since you love the question, Chris, clearly one for you. I'll come in after you.
Well, I won't cheat on this, I'll take it. So, I mean, so many of the issues that we look at today are based on the premise that we can understand international relations as though, first of all, it had no history. So the international system had no history. So we treat many of the states, 2/3 of the states that are members of the United Nations that are post-colonial states, we treat them as though they've been part of an international system of sovereign states for centuries, where in fact their histories come out of a system of empire. They bring with them a series of commitments, attitudes towards sovereignty, attitudes toward territoriality, attitudes towards central authority in the international system that are deeply coloured by that experience. And I don't think that's appreciated enough when we seek to understand how those states conduct themselves in international relations. Also, when we look at something, for example, when we look at the issue of China and the South China Sea, and we look at China and how China understands the rights that it might have within the South China Sea, those rights we look at through the lens of Westphalian sovereignty, as though China has always been a Westphalian sovereign state through its history. Whereas one of the advantages of this kind of volume is it enables us to understand the histories of these states, their changing configurations as systems of political authority. In China, that transformation has been enormous. And it gives us a better purchase on how the Chinese understand their relationship to the South China Sea, to East Asia, and how they might understand that in ways different from the way in which the standard Westphalian template that we impose on this. Now, that's pretty important for policy relevance, because it's pretty important for thinking about how the Australian government, the United States government, seeks to navigate the kind of claims that are being made by these states in the international system. Whereas what we're doing is we're essentially applying a set of assumptions to the priorities of these states around these issues that in fact their histories and the histories of the international system would suggest are far more complex.
I mean, it's clearly not a manual. We wouldn't be going to Canberra or going to New York and saying this is actually a manual for the post-American world. It's clearly not that. But what we do hope is that it's a big contribution to how we ought to be thinking about the international. And there's some fabulous chapters I might just point to as illustrations. So, for example, in a chapter on war by Paul Keel, he actually shows how international society has developed a particular kind of understanding of war, which of course completely elides the experience of violence across history and across cultures. And he beautifully kind of questions our understandings. And I think that any diplomat that's engaged in conflict resolution probably needs to be aware of the fact that, violence and warfare is not quite as straightforward in terms of what's included and what's not, as it's understood really through the international sort of society lens. That's one example. There's a really nice chapter by Sarah Tide, the University of Queensland R2P Centre, and of course she does a lot of policy work herself on women and security and also on China. But one of the things that Sarah shows us is that understandings of responsibility are not so divergent as many kind of liberals in the West might like to claim, but actually we get notions of norm localization and not notions of internalization in different kind of cultures. And what comes about actually is a significant debate about, well, what does responsibility mean in our particular country, in our particular region, and how might we have a conversation diplomatically and culturally about ways in which our conception of responsibility, which might mean not using force, which might mean not intervening, can be reconciled in some sort of a diplomatic framework that's well understood, can be recognized with some of the harder-edged internationalist understandings of responsibility, which precisely do obligate states to actually get involved in other people's problems. So it's part of if you like, it's part of that pluralistic mutual understanding that really is the meta contribution, I think, of the book. And we think policy people are equally need to engage in that in the same way that we like to engage in what the policy world is thinking about.
I could talk international relations theory with you guys all day, but I am seeking professional help in order to get over that ailment. I do have, though, one final question for you, which is, obviously since the book has come out, or really as it was coming out, we've had the Orange Swan event, the election of President Trump. The English school talks a lot about the revolt against the West. Brexit and Trump, in some respects, seem to appear to be a revolt of the West, or of a collapse in political consensus behind a lot of the institutions and practices that have undergirded at least the Western-dominated portion of international society since 1945. I'd be really interested to get your sense of, is there a possibility that we might be observing the partial deglobalization of international society?
Well, one way of answering that in the affirmative is to say, really, we might be getting the deglobalization, but also the regionalization of international society. And to some extent, our story in this book actually begins with a plurality of international societies around the 1400, 1500, your chapter as an example, and there are others in the book that actually talk about the multiplicity of international societies that essentially are limited in scope. They're not global. And it may well be that one of the responses to the hollowing out, if you like, of international society from the liberal West, the Atlantic powers, if you like, is that we may actually get a stronger African regional international society, and the African Union is an example, possibly, of those institutions becoming more deeply embedded. We already know we've got quite strong Latin American forms of governance in many areas. Similarly, we're getting a really strong, Asian Development Bank and so on. We're getting a strong Sino-based sort of regional order. So to that extent, we might be finding actually international society being scaled up from regions, if you like, rather than being something that mediates between sovereign states and some sort of global order. But I guess another way to think about it would be to say that there have been many examples where great powers have been at odds with the rules of international society. I don't remember at the time of George W. Bush and post 9/11, I don't really remember the United States actually standing behind the rules and norms of international society. It was very much articulating a very different and quite radical revisionist account of international society. You're with us or you're against us. You won't find that in the UN Charter. You won't find that in accounts of international society. So I think perhaps another response to that point is to say, let's not be too hasty in thinking that the moment a great power stops playing by the rules, the game's up. I mean, great powers really haven't been very good at playing by the rules all along. It's often been the smaller states, middle powers, and it's often been the non-Western world that's been far more committed to the rules of the game than the great irresponsibles.
Great. That is an optimistic note for us to end on. which is something we always like to experience in Research in Profile. At the risk of incurring your wrath, Tim, I want to reinforce my congratulations for what truly is a titanic intellectual achievement. So thank you again for joining us in Research in Profile, and I commend the book to all of you that are viewing this, and goodbye from Research in Profile. Thanks again for listening.